The Soft Opening, a story of learning to relax. The day before the soft opening of Flor y Palabra, Tucson's first monsoon of the season was gathering itself above the Catalina Mountains, dark arms stretching across the horizon as if preparing to sweep the heat from the city. People along University Boulevard kept glancing upward, murmuring to one another as they passed the storefronts on their way to summer classes, frozen raspados, or the shade of the campus arcades. That rising electricity in the air, that held breath, was as much a part of Tucson as adobe walls and the low desert dusk. Inside the bookstore-café, Enedelia Salazar stood in the children's corner, adjusting the position of a book she had already shifted twice. Where the flame trees bloom leaned against a wooden crate Miguel had sanded for her, next to Esperanza Rising and an array of bright titles by Alma Florada. The tiny papel picado banners Lila hung earlier in the day fluttered in the draft from the swamp cooler. It should have been perfect. It wasn't. She crouched, studying the display from another angle. Rose again. Lifted the dreamer half an inch. Too far. She nudged it back. Her shoulders tightened. Her jaw ached, and a dull thrum pulsed at the base of her skull, a familiar signal she had ignored for weeks. Everything had to be right. Everything. Not just for the customers. Not even for herself. For her grandmother. The very name of her bookstore had been chosen to honor her. Flor y Palabra. Flower and word. She stepped back, exhaled, and tried to shake off the tension, but it clung to her like humidity before a storm. The sun-linked streetcar glided past the shop's wide front windows, the reflection of its soft blue lights sliding over her face. She barely noticed. All she could see was what still needed to be done. Tomorrow was a soft opening. Flyers had been distributed on campus. She had posted announcements in local groups, talked with neighboring businesses on University Boulevard's south side, and targeted the summer session students at the nearby University of Arizona. If she pulled this off, if the shop's launch went well, she would feel she'd honored her grandmother's legacy in a way that mattered. But if she failed, she didn't let herself finish the thought. Sonora, years ago. The ranch in Sonora always smelled of dust and mesquite honey. It was older than her grandmother, older than the stories anyone could name. Ancestors long absent from the family's Day of the Dead ofrenda had been born and buried beneath the same mountain that sent its wide shadow sweeping across the land each morning. Summers there meant losing track of time, riding out into the sun, and helping her grandmother with her quiet work in the shade of the courtyard. Her grandmother had tended to a small, gentle collection of remedies that she kept in a wooden chest. To create them, she gathered flowers in the morning and lowered them into bowls of clear well water, setting them in the sun until the late afternoon. Sometimes the verbena flowers, wild purple sparks, floated in a cluster, their scent barely more than a whisper. Let the light teach the water, she would say. At 10, Enedelia did not understand how light could teach anything, but she believed her grandmother understood the language of sunlight better than anyone else. Sometimes workers came to the courtyard, uncertain or shy, a man overwhelmed by too many responsibilities, a young mother stretched thin by noise and need. Her grandmother listened with a patience that felt like shade itself. She always said the same thing when handing someone a small bottle. It won't change everything for you, but it may help you remember what your own strength feels like. Even then, the gentleness of that struck something inside the girl, but she didn't understand it yet. Not really. Her grandmother's true calling, though, was teaching people to read. Not in a formal classroom, but wherever she could gather a few souls willing to learn. Inside the shade of the old shed when the sun was fierce, beneath the mesquite's wide branches when the evenings ran long. Children from the ranch would come after chores, dust on their boots and eagerness in their eyes, sitting beside cowboys who had spent decades pretending they didn't care about books. Her grandmother guided each lesson with the same reverence she gave to prayer. Patient syllables, stories treated like treasures, letters traced in dirt until they became familiar friends. She believed literacy wasn't simply a skill, but a doorway, one that let a person step into their own voice. And Enedelia had grown up watching lives shift in those small, everyday miracles, and it was this legacy more than anything that lived in her bones. Back on University Boulevard. By late evening, Tucson's heat had slowed, replaced by that strange heaviness that sits on the skin just before rain. The sky had turned an inky purple, vibrating with the promise of release. Inside Flor y Palabra, fluorescent light buzzed softly as Enedelia wiped down the cafe tables for the third time. Her employees had left hours earlier, giving her uncertain glances she hadn't wanted to interpret. She'd been too harsh when she'd corrected Miguel's shelf labels, too quick to override Lila's ideas for the front window, too sharp in tone when a volunteer friend offered to help set up the poetry corner. She wasn't proud of herself, but she couldn't relax. Not now. The bell over the door jingled. She froze, then relaxed when she saw a familiar figure stepping inside. Renee, her mentor from Startup Tucson. Short gray hair, linen shirt slightly damp from the rising humidity, and a canvas tote bag slung over her shoulder. She always carried the same bag. "You're still here," Renee said, pushing her glasses up her nose as she looked around the shop. "I should start charging you rent for the time you spent holding this place together with sheer anxiety." "Just finishing up," Renee snorted. "You passed finishing up about 3 hours ago." The older woman walked slowly through the space, admiring the shelves, the carefully composed selections of Latin American literature, the poetry corner filled with Mexican and Mexican-American authors, the children's nook blooming with color. The metal sign outside the window read Libros para el alma, its letters bent by hand. "It looks wonderful," Renee said softly. "It could be better." "It already is better," her mentor replied. "You're just standing too close to see it." For a brief second, the knot inside Enedelia loosened, but then she imagined a crooked book stack being noticed tomorrow and felt tension clamping down again. "You're trying to honor her," Renee said, watching her carefully. "Your grandmother. But perfectionism isn't the same as honoring." The words struck deep. This ball of anxiety and short temper Enedelia had been turned into for the last few weeks was the opposite of her grandmother's calm, generous nature. After Renee left, the shop grew quiet except for the occasional distant boom of thunder. Enedelia sat at one of the cafe tables with her laptop and typed. Feeling overwhelmed but can't let go. Which batch remedy? A list of links appeared. Articles, sellers, and discussions. One link led her to Reddit. She clicked, skimmed old threads, and then, after a long hesitation, opened a new post on a small subreddit dedicated to batch flower essences and similar modalities. She typed, "Opening a bookstore tomorrow. I'm exhausted and can't stop micromanaging everything. I want it to honor someone I love, but now I'm so tense I can't breathe normally. I'm not looking for miracles, just some balance. Any remedy suggestions?" She hovered over the post button and then clicked. She expected silence. Instead, replies began arriving within minutes. "Sounds like vervain," one wrote. "Vervain for when passion gets too tight," another added. "You care deeply, and that's good. Vervain helps with the part that clenches. I used it to stop vibrating like a hummingbird during finals." As she read, memory stirred. A bowl of verbena blossoms floating in sunlight on an adobe wall. She ordered a bottle online from a local seller who offered late-night courier delivery. Tucson is full of night owls. Someone delivered it just before midnight. She placed a few drops on her tongue. No fireworks, no sudden revelation. Just a sense, faint but real, that the walls around her chest weren't as tight. She cleaned up the shop, locked the door, and went home. For the first time in weeks, she slept deeply. Soft opening Saturday. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the University Boulevard with a crisp clarity only seen after midnight rain. The monsoon had drenched the streets, releasing the scent of creosote and wet asphalt. The air was cooler. Not cool, never that in July, but gentler. Foot traffic began mid-morning as students wandered to cafes, some lured by the chalkboard sign outside her shop advertising Café de Olla and new arrivals. Inside, the store felt alive. Miguel brewed a pot of Café de Olla whose cinnamon-orange warmth perfumed every corner. Lila ran a children's story circle on the woven rug using Where Wonder Grows and The Dreamer, her voice lilting as the kids leaned in like flowers toward light. And things happened. Imperfect things. A stack of books fell over. A toddler smeared raspberry jam on a bookshelf. A local poet asked if she could set up a tiny reading later in the afternoon, if there's space. A misplaced price tag made a customer chuckle. A month ago, each event would have knotted itself into her spine. But something had softened. She still felt the intensity. She always would. But it was no longer running the entire show. She made small adjustments without panic, accepted help without defensiveness, smiled more easily than she expected. Around noon, Renee walked in. "You look different," her mentor said, studying her face. "I'm trying to leave more space," Enedelia replied. "For others?" "For myself, too." Renee stood beside her for a moment, watching the customers drifting through the aisles, the chalkboard menu hand-drawn by Lila, the cluster of books celebrating Mexican authors arranged with gentle reverence. "You've built something beautiful," she said. This time the words didn't sting. They landed. Storm again. By mid-afternoon, another monsoon wave approached. The wind picked up, carrying the metallic promise of rain. The sky darkened as if some giant were pulling a velvet curtain across it. A small leak began near the poetry section. A thin drizzle of water from a ceiling seam started tapping directly onto a stack of Sandra Cisnero books. A few weeks ago, this would have been a catastrophe. Now she called calmly, "Miguel, let's move these." He hurried over, and together they shifted the books. Lila found a bucket. A customer offered to hold the ladder if they needed to check the ceiling tile. Someone else remarked that monsoon leaks were basically Tucson's unofficial summer mascot. It became a shared moment, not a crisis. Rain fell harder, drumming on the awning. The streetcar's bell rang as it passed by, sending warm reflection through the window. Enedelia stepped outside beneath the awning and watched the rain flood the street in silver sheets. The scent of wet creosote rose like memory. She touched the small bottle of vervain in her pocket, not with dependence, but gratitude. Somewhere, faintly, she could almost smell verbena and adobe dust. It hadn't solved her grief. It hadn't fixed her patterns. But it had helped loosen the grip she kept on her own heart long enough for community to slip its warm hands in. Behind her, she heard Miguel laughing with customers. Children squealed in delight at thunder. The poet from earlier had sat up in a corner, reading softly to a handful of listeners. The world was happening, messy and alive and shared. She closed her eyes. The storm washed the last of the rigidity from her shoulders. Her grandmother would have loved this imperfect beauty, this gathering of stories, this bookstore breathing with community. And for the first time since her grandmother's passing, honoring her felt like joy rather than obligation. When she finally stepped back inside, the shop glowed like a hearth. And she knew, truly knew, that she was not carrying the stream alone anymore. Thank you for spending a little time in this story with me. A story about softening, about letting the world help hold what matters, about remembering that even the most precious dreams don't have to be carried alone. Vervain is the essence we turn to when our passion begins to harden into strain, when dedication becomes a tight fist instead of an open hand. It doesn't quiet our fire. It simply helps it burn in a way that warms rather than exhausts. In Enedelia's case, it offered just enough ease for community to step in and for grief to loosen its hold and become something more spacious. Please like the video if the story resonated. Subscribe if you'd like more gentle tales paired with flower essences, and leave a comment to share what part touched you most. Until next time, may you find a little more ease, a little more rest, and a little more space for yourself.